My idea for the session today is that we'll start off, I'll do an introduction, a beginning of a talk on concepts of collective identity, as I was asked to do. And then I'd like to split you up into some smaller groups so you yourselves can have some shots at putting these into action. I'm conscious that over the week you're going to be talking about some great techniques and processes and methods for getting at some of the questions that we're looking at today. And I hope this will give you some ideas for some questions. I was always taught that a lecture shouldn't be a series of answers. You shouldn't sit in the audience and expect me to give you the answers to what are the concepts of collective identities. But if I can make you leave this room with a few questions bubbling in your heads, then hopefully, or feed into some of the questions you've already got bubbling away, then that would feel like an achievement to me today. So let's get on with it then and see some thoughts on the concepts of collective identity. I should also say I'm deeply intimidated by being the first person to speak in very illustrious company this week. So I'll be really interested to hear what follows. I'll be asking Philip for the feedback on the week on how it all develops. Okay, so concepts of collective identity. No small question then. You won't be surprised that I'm only going to deal with really relatively small parts of this. And you'll have noticed from the reading list, I hope, that I haven't included literatures that deal explicitly with European Union identity. And I did that for a very deliberate purpose. And that's because I think you have to think about the nature of a developing European Union identity. Is it in fact unique? Is it in fact something special and different? Or is it actually following many of the similar trajectories to other, what have been at different points in time, identities in the process of formation? And for that reason, I'm specifically pointing you in the direction of some very classic literature on community formation, state formation, and the role of identity within that process. So most specifically and most obviously, the literatures on nationalism. So I'm making no suggestion that the EU is or can be or should ever be a nation state, but simply to suggest that really these literatures on the process of nation and state formation have some very important insights that at the very least allow us to determine whether or not we feel the EU is in fact unique or whether it's following actually rather similar trajectories to other processes that have taken place in other periods and other contexts and time. So specifically the things that I want to draw your attention to today, and I guess as I'm working through the lecture, are... not mine. Oh, no, I've messed up. Sorry, I might need somebody who knows how to use this. I've got 4 buttons and I've pressed the one to the left. Thank you. Okay, so as I say, what I've actually done is looked to hopefully challenge you to think about how traditional approaches could or could not give us insights into this process. And specifically, what we're going to be talking about and thinking about today are the relationship between identity and interest. One of the things that you'll all be familiar with in the literature on EU identity is particularly the shift to post-functionalism. Obviously, the Hookian works and discussion about the need for something more than simply interest-driven accounts of and functionalist accounts of European integration have been hugely influential. And of course, they do not suggest a complete distinction between identity and interest. However, in a lot of the subsequent literature, we're starting to see a notion that it could be either interest or identity that's driving European integration. So one of the first things I want to talk about is the relationship between identity and interest, or perhaps more clearly, the relationship between affective and evaluative aspects of identity. Because I think interests also form a part of identity, and I think that's an important part of the traditional literature on identities. The second thing that I want to talk about today is the concept of context and of contingency. So when we're learning from past theories, Obviously, we're not in the same processes of modernisation, we're not in the same processes of unification, post-national unification. We're not seeing the same driving forces that are traditionally associated with national movements of industrialisation and modernisation. However, what early writers pointed to was a relationship between context and identity formation. And what we need to tease out is how context matters. They may not be the same context, but they may still matter. And how do they matter? How do they shape the process of identification or otherwise with the European Union or with its component parts? That leads quite obviously into the question of time and process. How do time and process fit into our understandings of the effect or otherwise of identity? One of the very, for me, memorable points in my learning about European integration were the very early studies that took Deutsch and said, well, this simply isn't happening. Deutsch had argued that as transactions between the member states increased, we would get increasing recognition and understanding of complementarity and ability to communicate with one another, and gradually a sense of community would develop. Of course, not specifically in relation to the European Union, but in terms of the process of community formation. And of course, very early studies simply said, well, there's been lots of transactions, but we haven't got lots of Europeanism, and therefore this doesn't work. But where does time fit into that? And of course, a classic quote from Deutsch is that nationalism is a process that emerges over generations. And I think that's terribly important when we're jumping into the study of European identity, to think how really, really young this body is that we are studying, and to take into account both time and the processual nature of identity formation. Then I want to talk a little bit about motivations and drivers. Does identity just spring up? Or does somebody want there to be a European identity? What drives the process of European identity? And again, I think that's a really ripe subject for the study of European identity and its relationship with the integration process. So we'll talk a little bit about motivations and drivers, or if you like in Deutsche terms, pioneers and awakeners, organisers of the identity movement. And then we're going to talk a little bit about symbols and the role that symbols play in harnessing and constructing and reconstructing and strengthening and underpinning identification as a process and as part of the broader political dynamics of something that forms European integration. So, again, I stress that what I guess is my underpinning story here is, let's not assume that EU identity is immediately a different beast. Let's explore its differences. Let's find out how much it is similar and how much it is different in terms of the processes that have influenced its emergence, such that it is, or I'm conscious that Sophie's here, isn't actually a phenomenon at all. Okay, well, I really like Gellner, as you'll find that from most of my work. And I really love Gellner's notion of, does the EU, well, does the nation, in his case, need a navel? And I think one of the things for us as academics is navel gazing tends to be one of our great strengths. You know, we're quite good at that bit. But sometimes when we look too internally, we forget to look at the wider processes and political phenomena that form the subject that we are actually interested in. And I think this is a terribly important reminder in the study of European identity. Now, I mean, here you have a convert. I believe that European identity matters, but perhaps not as much as might be expected. I think what initially interested me in studying European identity was exactly that story that I told you, the early stories that said there just isn't a European identity, there isn't a demos. Without this demos, European integration can only go so far, it will always be limited. Without a European people, it will never really be a Europe. It will always maintain its difference, this supranational organisation. And at that time, I was very involved for my own thesis in reading the literatures on community and state formation, and I was really interested in the notion of the EU as, if you like, a nascent nation state. And my initial, I guess, motivation for studying European identity was that I felt that we actually underestimated the amount that was out there. The trend at that period was really to say there wasn't European identity. Not that many people identified themselves as Europeans. It hadn't moved on as much as people thought it would. There wasn't the kind of mobility that people had anticipated. We weren't all moving about quite as much, and now they are moving more, but initially they weren't. It just wasn't quite happening in the way that people, and I guess I would like to say some people had hoped, not just expected, but there was always, and always has been, a normative movement around the European Union. So I guess my initial, as with all academics, one really likes to go and find something that doesn't fit with the norms, and I went looking, and my feeling was that there was actually more European identity than these traditional measures were showing up. And particularly at that time I was drawn to the work of people like Michael Billig, who said at the national level we often overestimate the importance of the big, hot national symbols. At that time in the EU, the equivalent was, Anthony Smith's "Who would die for Europe?" And we were all like, well, of course, nobody's going to die for Europe, so there's no EU identity, so, we'll stop looking. But what the insights of people like Billig were was that it's not always the day when there's a big football match or when there's a war or when it's the national day and we're waving our flags, but that actually on a very daily standard basis, people are constantly reminded that they are members of a nation. Now, of course, for the national, those reminders are triggering something more deep-seated. They're triggering a sense of national identity that one has been brought up with, one has been schooled with. And the EU, of course, cannot be that. But it still seemed to me that on a daily basis, as I had been an Erasmus student, as I had been EU-funded to go and travel the world with my contemporary Europeans, and as a good third of those on my course, which is now a long time ago and long precedes the much more mobile young people, a good third of those people ended up either teaching about the EU or working on EU projects, it seemed to me that something in fact was going on. And for most of us, on a daily basis, we were increasingly reminded that the EU was part of our lives. And as passports came in and as driving licences came in, obviously in the UK there's still lots of resistance. We don't have the number plates, but we're very familiar with them everywhere. And it seemed to me that although that may not be reaching in and triggering some kind of deep-seated national identity, as you would expect in banal Europeanism, in banal nationalism, that in fact what we might be seeing was an emerging low-level, simple, accidental acceptance that one is an EU citizen. Just a recognition that it's out there. And so it seemed to me that perhaps when we were saying that there wasn't much EU identity, we were maybe just going a little bit too far. There was maybe a bit more than people even themselves knew. But that wasn't something they were going to say in a Eurobarometer survey. Using a passport every day, using a driving licence every day, doesn't mean that when somebody says, "Are you Portuguese or European?" you're likely to say, "Oh, I'm European, I really, really feel European." But it may mean that if somebody says, I think we're going to leave Europe because, well, Portugal's a good case, we've just had the situation in Greece, because really this is just not all working out to our advantage. That when that kind of threat comes in place, a bit like a child with an old dusty toy in the corner of their room, suddenly they realise it was valued a little bit more to them than they thought. I can say this because I'm in the process of moving house with a 13-year-old who has a castle in the corner of his room that is really thick with dust. And I have repeatedly said, see that castle, do you think maybe it could go to the cousins, it could move on? And he's repeatedly, oh no, that's really, that's mine, that really, really matters to me. But it only matters when the point is to move it on, to give it to somebody else. And my question is, in terms of European integration, and I'll come back to this later, is it the case that actually we're more implicitly, more unconsciously attached to this union than perhaps we would ever explicitly state in terms of hot Europeanism. Okay. But now in contrast, so that was my interest. I really felt there was really too little interest in European identity. Now in contrast, I have to say it's quite a growth industry. European identity, and you're a great example of it, really has gone on leaps and bounds and become much, much more nuanced. We've got great, really detailed attitudinal and correlational studies using huge and complex data sets looking at European identity. We've got fabulous work, and again, I've got Sophie in the corner on focus groups, finding out what people actually do or don't rate as important in their identities. Hans-Jörg Trench will speak to later in the week. Fabulous studies on communication and the creation of a European public sphere, or a normalisation of the EU. So we really have and are moving to developing that. We've got a long, long way to go. And the great thing, I think, is that we're moving away from just asking how much European identity, because for a long time that was really what we did. We measured how many people say, I am European, and we tried to make correlational links between that and the integration process. But what I think is really exciting now, and what I think is a real opportunity, is to now stop asking how much European identity there is, and ask much more what kind of European identity there is, how does it emerge, but also why does it emerge. And let's not make any assumptions that the motivations and drivers of European identity are unimportant, or that in the case of looking at something like banal Europeanism, that is benign. The process of creating an identity is a really powerful tool. And it's important that we, as scholars of identity, not only look at how it's created, but why it's being created, and who is creating that. Okay, apologies for this huge quote, but I do love Brubaker, and for copyright reasons I can't have lots of images, so I have to have some words. So, as I said, there's a huge growth industry now in the study of European Union identity. And there is a huge EU publicity machine which has as its sole work publicising the EU, making sure that the symbol is fully exposed, checking that its symbols are being associated with the EU, and making sure that no developments take place that aren't labelled as EU developments. Again, you have Jeff Checkle talking to you later this week, and he's been very clear that these very heavy-handed top-down socialisation techniques aren't really all that effective in generating European identity. However, if we think about them in terms of a banal and constant implicit message to members of the public that they belong to the EU, then we might have some different understandings of why they matter. But here, I guess, this is my note of caution from Brubaker. Brubaker I love as the great developer of great ideas on nationalism, but always the arch sceptic on how useful discussions of national identity actually are. Where are the boundaries, and what do we use them for? But particularly here, one of the things he says, and what I was talking about when I said you have to be careful there isn't just too much notion that EU identity matters, is that scholars also play a role in, if you like, reifying, putting on a pedestal the notion of EU identity as driving European integration. And I think it's terribly important that we continue always to problematise the relationship between EU identity and European integration. There may or may not be EU identity. It may or may not come in lots and lots of different forms. But how it relates to European integration is a question. Because there's more European identity doesn't necessarily mean there is more European integration or more support for European integration. And these are things that I think are lovely and right for us to keep problematising and asking. For me, one of my, I guess, the most influential scholars always for me, and the one that my poor students have to listen to in every class, is the Allisonian notion of Graham Allison's understanding of the real importance of thinking about our conceptual lenses when we address a study. And in addressing the study of identity, I think it's terribly important to think of the Allisonian parable, if you like. And he talks about how, as analysts, if we were like Fischer people, throwing out our nets to capture our data, if our nets are of a particular size, we'll only catch what we went fishing for. And we have to make sure that when we are studying something as complex and as difficult as European identity, we keep adjusting the size of our nets so that we can actually find out where the relationships lie and not simply capture the data that supports whatever conceptual lens we are working on. So, in terms of European identity, I would say it's like learning to be a European. And in understanding the process of learning to be a European, I use European loosely here in all my work. I'm very careful to say European Union citizen because I am talking about the European Union and not broader Europe. But I think Adler and Haas give us a great insight into how to study the process of learning to be something. And that is to ask the questions, who learns what, to whose benefit, and why? And they're the kind of questions I would like to keep poking at the back of your minds when you're looking at the European Union. So coming back to where I started from then, in that Gellnerian sense, Gellner says some nations have navals, some achieve navals, and some have navals thrust upon them. Those possessed of genuine ones are probably in the minority, but it matters little. And I think, again, for the study of European identity, this is important to us. He was talking, of course, about the contrast between those who believed, primordialists, who believed that ethnic identities are a given. You know, they're fixed, we're born with them, our families replicate them in us, and we, I will be a Scot, and a Scot I will be, and we see these as something that it would take a huge change to shift. Whereas, of course, the modernists, the modernisers saw identity as emerging from processes of modernisation through which people shaped attachments to a state structure. And in fact, of course, what Gellner says is that there are combinations. There are deeper-seated identities that have been there for so many generations that we hardly know that they are or aren't primordial. But there are also identities that emerge over time through a series of processes associated with the context in which they develop. And there are also identities, navals, that people put quite a considerable amount of effort into generating. And these processes are also important processes. Who wants to generate these? Why do they want to generate them? What are the processes through which they may or may not be generated? So, from that perspective, I think it's more important to look at what the function of identity is and to whom, to ask what the nature of European Union identity is and why, and to ask how the nature and function of European Union identity might change over time. Okay. Again, coming back to Gellner, I think one of the important stories he tells is that nationalism, and in this case we might read European identity, is not an awakening. It created nations where they didn't exist previously. And if we're looking at the European Union, I think we have really quite a nice story of how that collective identity is being shaped and created by a variety of forces. So, European Union identity, I think Leighton's understanding here of identity information is terribly useful and really helpful in conceptualising European Union identity. So we're not looking at something fixed that we can say now or isn't, now will or will never be, but simply something that is in the process of formation and under certain circumstances, and that's the joy of developing your hypotheses, is more or less likely to develop and is more or less likely to be encouraged or viable in certain circumstances. However, for my own part, to put a view on identity information, my argument would be that that's not unique. What we are looking at is a process at a unique point in time, but not a unique process. This is a process that has gone on many, many times. Most nations did not emerge from single ethnic units. Many emerged from multiple early states. Many different reasons and pressures have concurred and come together to create an identity and to link an identity to an organisational unit, traditionally the nation-state, but in our case, the European Union. So in looking at this process, just to work something I'll come back to in the conclusion, I think most important is to distinguish between identification as the I am a Scot or a European, or I am Greek or German. Identification with the actual state of being, the being attached to something, which you may not consciously be aware of. We can easily be more attached to things, as I described in terms of my son's castle, than we actually think we are. And if we're asked, we'll say, that's not for us. But when somebody wants to take it away from us, we might find that we're a little bit more attached than we thought we were to start with. And crucially, to distinguish between both of these and support for European integration. Identity and support are simply not the same things, and it's terribly important to problematise the relationship between identification as, identification with, and support for the European Union. Okay, so I said I wanted to talk about contingency and contextual nature of European identity. And you know, one of my favourites here is the notion of the nation which people take for granted. If there was ever something people think is an inherent attachment, is their attachment to their nation. And yet, Renan, back in 1882, says, the existence of a nation is a daily plebiscite. And that really removes us from this romantic, attachment, affective-driven understanding of how we link to our nations. It starts to bring in a much more rational cost-benefit calculation about, how's this working out for me? Is this the nation that I want to be attached to? And of course, it's not as simple as that. These two begin to shape and work with each other. But it does remind us that that relationship between interest and identity is incredibly important. This is very, very much the tradition that Karl Deutsch and others worked on when they argued that political habits of loyalty, and I think this habitual nature is terribly important, that political habits of loyalty can easily be moved up or down, either to a more supranational body or down to a more devolved body, if individuals begin to believe that the different level of government offers them a better way of life. And that really does take us away from this notion that we are always inherently and deeply attached to the nation. And of course, at the moment, as a Scot, in the middle of an independence referendum, we have very good examples of people who, throughout the 1960s, asked, it's a fabulous thing, if you go travelling in the Scottish Highlands and you go to hotels, the old travellers' hotels, Victorian hotels, and you look at the visitors' books, and people will give their address as Edinburgh or Glasgow in the heart of Scotland. And when asked what nationality they are throughout most of the 1960s, they'll say British. And then you start to look as you progress into the late 70s and into the early 80s, when dissatisfaction in Scotland began to develop with the regime in the UK, or particularly under Thatcherism, and gradually you see people labelling themselves as Scots. These are, if there was ever one of the primordial identities, Scots is supposed to be one of these. But what you are seeing is people willing to shift from Brits to Scots and back again, according to the situation, and particularly according to how they think the welfare state's been treated by either level of government. That fits incredibly well with the Deutschian story. So while at an early stage in the development of the European Union, the notion that the European Union could challenge the legitimacy of the national state governments, and even now, seems a little far-fetched. Remember the story of over generations. And think about the different developments that are taking place. Things that people may now have become attached to that if they saw removed, they would think, oh, we're quite used to that. We're quite used to crossing these borders without showing our passports, or we're quite used to not changing our money now. The Greek exit referendum was a really interesting story there, where with a decline in formal support for European integration, the question still asked, do you want to come out, was no. It's much more scary to leave this established organisation than to stay in it, even in very, very difficult circumstances. An interesting story. So this notion of identity as contingent and contextual, I think, is terribly important. Whether it is seen as secure and taken for granted, whether it's under threat, whether or not there is a legitimate alternative, are terribly important in our calculations of what drives identification or loyalty at any given level, whether at an implicit level or at an explicit level. Of course, though, and this again is something that we'll come back to in a moment, is if our identification or our loyalty at a particular level is contingent on the provision of valued goods by that level, we also have the question of how do we decide what goods are valued? How do we shape our understanding of what we appreciate and what we think is valuable? And how do we decide who would be a legitimate provider of those valued goods that we would be willing to give our allegiance to? Okay, sorry, again, these are a bit too many words, but you can have them. You will have the slides, you don't have to write them down. Okay. So, identity and interest, the relationship between the two. Identity, in the vast majority of the traditional literature, is seen to have both affective, sentimental components and interest-driven components that, in different contexts, rise in precedence at different points in time. But what we tend to be looking at is a balance of affective and evaluative processes rather than a domination of one or the other at a permanent time. We've seen a lot in the literature using things like Deutsch to argue that you'll see a greater communication and cultural renaissance in the European identity sphere. But actually, scholars like Deutsch really focused on what they called a functional definition of nationality. If you actually read what they required for a national identity, it was very, very low-level complementarity, an ability to communicate with each other, to understand the broader regime and broader goals within which one operated, but much less of a hot sense of I am European or I belong to this community, much more of a sense of, yeah, I get we're all moving broadly in the same direction, I can hear what you're saying, you can hear what I'm saying, I think we could all work together and therefore we can form and develop this community which over time may develop into something to which we feel more sentimentally attached, but it may also not. And that, of course, is our question. What is the relationship between cooperation and integration? The second aspect to the notion of a functional understanding of identity is also to take it out of the economic. Once we move to the functional and the cost-benefit analysis, it tends to be, how much am I actually going to benefit from this particular good? But of course, really key, and it doesn't take much explaining there, these goods do not have to be economic in nature. I mean, psychological security is what, for example, Bloom would use in social identity theory, the notion of belonging to this bigger block, safety in numbers, being looked after, not to mention strategic security, actual physical security, which is terribly important as a backdrop to European integration, also has a key role in this contingent understanding of whether I should or shouldn't be attached to this level of government. Hardin, particularly, in his very rational understanding of group membership, which he applies to national identity, which I deliberately put on the reading list because I think particularly in this field we do tend to look in a much more constructivist story of how identities emerge and are created and how we create a public sphere. But there are also quite hard, rational scholars looking at this process from a very different direction. And the Hardin book's particularly interesting from that perspective, to give you a different angle on this process. And one of the things that he argues is that we may actually become hot flag waving nationalists or Europeans, but not actually be aware that there's a fairly rational calculation of values and utility that are leading us to attach to this particular group. So this is perfectly possible that we might actually believe that this group is an inherent good, where in fact it's really just quite a practical good that's helping us to resolve particular issues and to achieve values and goods, valued goods that we are looking for. So the fact that when we are asked in a survey we don't recognise the functional basis of our attachment doesn't mean that we don't have a functional basis. We may simply have that, if you like, masked in the sentiment and hype and excitement of national membership, particularly in conflict situations. But lastly, I wouldn't want to suggest, and this is where I'm always cautious about how one puts this, it's not identity versus interest. Identity has both sentimental and interest elements. And just because identity includes functional or cost-benefit calculations within it doesn't mean that sentiment is absent or doesn't matter. Gellner again has a really great quote. He says, you know, this is only offensive to you if you genuinely believe that identity just springs up from a sort of wellspring of primordial growth. For most of us, we can recognise that we are sentimentally attached, perhaps, to our nations, that we have a series of histories and stories and narratives that have fed that identification and sentiment for many, many years, but that when the chips are down and something's difficult, and we can also begin to reevaluate that and decide whether or not that sentiment weighs as highly as some of the other cost-benefit calculations. And key, I think, to this story, how that happens, the relationship between the affective and the evaluative, if you like, is the story of symbols. And how we use symbols to generate, if you like, the hot story, the affective, the sentimental story, to carry messages about the cost-benefit interest story, if you like. And this is a lovely classic story from Deutsch, where he says that one of the key things we need to understand is how wide the range of interest is and the volume of the communications that he was talking about are, but not just those, the experiences, because key is to the understanding of the development of identity and identification with a state or organisation is the extent to which we actually experience that body, the extent to which it actually impinges on our daily life. And this is very much part of something that would be relevant in social identity theory. People like Bloom take social identity theory into international relations, very much looking at this. How much does that body touch on the lives? How much is it actually experienced by the individuals that then develop, or otherwise, an identification? And part of the process that attaches those experiences, the ways in which one experiences these events, are the symbols to which they're attached. So when one is experiencing an event, or being funded, or travelling, getting faster through passport control, if a symbol is attached to that, saying this is something that is attached to this functional benefit, you should be recognising that attachment, then we're beginning to communicate what that body does. And basically one of the ways that Deutsch says you should measure how deep this development is taking place in the identification process is how much primary communication is attached to these secondary symbols and what kind of messages are being transmitted. And again, these are lovely projects for students to be looking at how these work out. But what I would absolutely state, and along with Deutsch say, is this is really sound power politics. This is not soft, touchy-feely, oh, identity is not about interests. Harnessing the power of interest to symbols that create an attachment as strong as identity is very, very powerful power politics. And we'll go on to look a little bit at the pioneers and the identity entrepreneurs and how they relate to that process. So, then to come back to the story that interests me. The notion of implicit identification with the European Union. I mentioned already Billig's understanding of banal nationalism, the notion that actually on a daily basis most of us walk past unwaved flags rather than shaking and flying the hot nationalism or the big waved flags. And this is very, very consonant with Gelmer's understanding that the cultures within which we live are often very much just like the air that we breathe. We're just not aware of them. We're taking them in on a daily basis. We're shaping them, absorbing them, and moving them on for the next set of people as well. Again, I would stress here that there is a big difference between banal and benign. That when these things are happening at an unconscious level, if they are being motivated or shaped by particular actors, we want to know what those drivers are and who's driving them, and coming back to Adler and Haas, who's learning what to whose benefit and why. In terms of implicit identification, I would argue that implicit identification is much, much more widespread than either identification as a European, I am a European, or support for the European Union. Also, somewhat counterintuitively, the implicit identification can also coexist with active Euroscepticism. One can be an active non-supporter of the European Union, but actually find that one is more attached than one thinks. And you can think of any number of examples in your own daily life where you might say, I really, really don't like that, and then when it's got to go, actually you're a little bit more attached than you think. And there's now been a number at the moment where we're looking in the UK at an EU referendum on membership. There have been a number of articles in the Quality Press particularly looking at how the EU has become so normal that within people's lives that there is a sense that that's actually a little more scary than you think. So those very active and vociferous Eurosceptics might be not quite as willing to take the leap as they are rhetorically. So how does implicit identification in the European Union take place? Well, a key aspect of this is allowing the reimagination of identity. And of course, you could not accept any of this if you don't think identity is contingent and contextual. Again, you'll have, I'm sure, a great talk from Michael Bruter later this week. And one of the things he said very early on about studies of European identity was that one of the problems with asking somebody how European they are is you've actually got no idea at all what that means to them. Yeah, great, I am European. Now, does it mean I live in Europe? Does it mean I live in the European Union? Does it mean it matters to you? Again, there's lovely quotes from Citron inside. You can say I'm an American. It doesn't tell you if I'm patriotic or not. What does that actually mean to us? And one of the things that emerges from the literature on community formation and identity is that the understanding of identity to any individual, both its meaning, what it means to you, and its utility, its place in your life, can change over time and changes over time and in different contexts. So one of the things that helps to shape implicit identification with the European Union is the ability to imagine and to reimagine one's identities over time. Deutsch, Haas and Mitrany all talked about the learned habits of integration, and I said early on it's really about learning to be a European Union. We learn how to imagine what it means, we change what that imagination means. But we also go through a process of forgetting what used to be. And that is terribly important. Willy in Banal Nationalism says, you know, the nation that celebrates its antiquity generally forgets its historical recency. And the European Union is a fabulous example of forgetting to remember the degree of strife between its member states. And this is absolutely central to the European Union. The collaboration today is the most fabulous puzzle, the thing that I open every lecture on European integration to my first-year students with. You know, it's just what is interesting is about the European Union is that it shouldn't be here. It's amazing that we have this level of integration between previously warring nations. And so the ability to forget and to see a growing and expanding and changing union as a community is a terribly important part to the development of identification with the European Union, and particularly when we think about the constantly changing boundaries, because one of the things we tend to associate with nationalism is the association between territory and attachment. And of course with the European Union we have these constantly changing territorial boundaries, and yet a remarkable capacity to adapt and shift our understanding of what a European Union citizen is with very little challenge, and to take that on board. Again, we have some fabulous. Again, you'll have Hans-Jörg Trents as well. You've got great speakers this week. I hesitate to be the first. And one of the things he's looked at in looking at the communication of the European Union is the way in which news about the European Union has shifted from being always something out there, news from abroad, to being part of the home news of most of the nations, simply part of the taken for granted, well, we're all European Union members, we're all part of a European Union member state, and this news is relevant to us. It's not always about, oh, the EU's done this terrible thing, or oh, the EU's doing this great thing, but simply this is news you will need to know because it's going to change your daily life. And that collective forgetting that this was actually quite revolutionary is quite fabulous in its own way, if you like. And of course that brings us to the last idea, the idea of just normalisation. The fact that on a daily basis, people, except in periods of strife, and obviously we have things like the UK referendum on whether to leave, but on a daily basis, most people aren't actually walking around going, should we be members of the EU or shouldn't we be members of the EU? For the most part, things like the very notion of member state are just a daily reminder that we're part of this bigger organisation and that this is completely normal. So this is, there's no single imagining of the European Union, none of the depth of solidarity that, for example, Anderson talked about in the imagined community, but multiple meanings, multiple imaginings that are able to coexist and gradually become normalised within the EU structure. Okay, I'm going to stop talking soon. So, what might be the relationship between the implicit identification with the European Union and moving towards an explicit identification with the European Union? And here, I think the concept of the EU as a meaningful presence, some of the things that we referred to earlier, the notion of actually having experienced the EU, the notion of the EU gradually touching on people's lives. And if you remember back to the very early discussions from Haas, that was very much his understanding of how integration would take place. That gradually politicisation would take place as people felt more aware of what was available at the EU level. They would shift, he talked about shifting their activities and expectations to the European Union level. And this notion that as the EU becomes a more meaningful presence, and of course it could become both a negative meaningful presence, it could become a daily thorn in your side, or a positive meaningful presence, as it touches upon lives, then there is a sense in which there's likely to be more or less explicit identification with the European Union. Particularly as valued goods appear to emerge more from that level. Deutsch used a particularly interesting way of understanding this, and he talked about the double process of habit breaking. So in terms of the learned habits of integration, I said is basically over time and gradually, perhaps without even knowing it, we absorb the habit of being EU members. We become gradually part of this bigger body. But we're not hugely aware of it. We're not hugely aware of how it impinges on our daily lives. But we gradually form this habit. And we see valued goods as coming from more than one level of government. But we won't easily just leap from one level to the next. It takes quite a lot to make us leap. And when he says you're most likely to leap is when the habits that you hadn't really been aware that you were attached to, when the valued goods that come from the new level of government come under threat. So perhaps your old level government says, oh, we don't want to do that anymore. We want to take away that part of what the EU does. So, for example, one of the great examples was cross-border health control, when people for a moment thought they could actually get all around Europe and get much cheaper and much more effective health control. And then the national governments come and say, well, I think we'd like a few rules in place here, let's tighten this up. So for a moment, people see what might be and what they are starting to think may be, and then when that's removed, he would argue they're more likely then to form an explicit understanding of whether they're attached or otherwise to the body. But, of course, one of the key things with a double process of habit breaking, a notion that valued goods could perhaps better be provided by another legitimate provider, is that our understanding of what's valued isn't neutral and doesn't come from nowhere. What happens to us as part of being part of a structure is we develop a set of mental models, or what you could call an appreciative system, a cognitive system through which we evaluate the value of the different goods. And in this process, that's when the role of identity entrepreneurs and pioneers in shaping our understandings of what's valued are also very, very important. So here I think that's where you begin to see the confluence of changing context, the context, for example, of threat, the emergence of another legitimate political authority, with the role of the pioneers, if you like, the top-down, the entrepreneurs, the movers and shapers who act as awakeners and organisers for the integration process. So people like Nairn would say, you know, identity never simply emerges from what people said at the top. Basically, you have to feel, you have to experience in some kind of social economic change, something that would matter to you, and that will make you shift. But at the same point, people like Gerlner say that that won't just happen by itself, it needs some motivation by one of these pioneers or awakeners. And even, if we go back to Brubaker's quote, the odd academic who will be pushing in that direction for European identity. Okay, so coming to the end, I think why this matters to me quite so much and why I think it is so hugely interesting is that the process of inventing a people, which is what creating an identity is simply not a neutral process. It's a terribly important, very, very exciting, but a process that we would like to have some input on and some understanding of what is driving it and how we can drive it too. And I love this quote from Morgan in terms of inventing the people and how so much of what we read and hear about European identity has a project behind it. And the fictions and the narratives that are developed around, and very often quite strong normative stories about European identity, are important. And again, coming back to the Brubaker story, that political world of make-believe can really play a role in shaping the real world. And sometimes even opposition to that political world of make-believe in itself reinforces the initial position. And of course, Morgan at the time tells a lovely story about how when sovereigntists opposed the establishment of parliaments, what they actually did was reinforce the very central place of parliament in the discussions of democratic government. And in this case, in the study of European Union identity, I think we have a big responsibility in studying European identity to ensure careful and considered understanding of the causal relationships that take place, a careful and considered understanding of what drives and motivates European identity and of the implications of European identity for European integration. And I think you're at a fabulous time to look at that. So just to finish off then, back with Gellner. Some nations have genuine navals, some get them invented for them, and some of them will never have a naval. And what I would say for you is, and for us, is that it's much better to ask what the function of European Union identity, what the function of any naval would be, and for whom, than simply to accept that or to make assumptions about the relationship between European identity and European integration. So I'll leave it at exactly an hour. And I thought the best thing we could do was maybe have a very short break, come back, have some questions, and then I'll split you into groups to do a bit of group work on some of the different concepts that have come up, and then come back, and I've got a very last thing from Deutsch I'd like you to have a think about. Okay, so if we just take, is it 5 or 10 minutes just to give them, it's a long time to sit and listen and keep your heads going. So please formulate lots of exciting questions, and then we'll come back, have a brief part of questions, and we'll split up to do a little bit of something on hand. Okay. Thank you.